Welcome back to AP US History. This is chapter 29. We were talking about Kennedy and his accomplishments in the 60s. And we left off with the Bay of Pigs, which turned out to be a fiasco. These Cuban exiles tried to retake Cuba, but were slaughtered by the communists. And this particular incident convinces Castro that he needs to get an ally, and he will turn to the Soviet Union. The CIA tried to assassinate him, but were unsuccessful. He just recently passed away. Cuba and the United States have broken off diplomatic relations since the Cuban Missile Crisis, and it's never ever been restored. I suspect that will end probably in the next few years, and we will have full diplomatic recognition of Cuba, even though it's a communist country. Peace Corps was somewhat of a very successful program. College students going out and volunteering, paid a small salary by the government, but they would volunteer in communities and third world communities to help people learn to read and write and use technology and learn how to farm better. Khrushchev met with Kennedy in 1961 in Paris. Uh, Kennedy doesn't make a favorable impression on Khrushchev. Khrushchev thinks that he's young, inexperienced, and can be pushed around. But he's going to find out that that's not the case. In 1961, there were so many Germans from the East Berlin side fleeing to West Berlin that it was an embarrassment to the Soviet Union and also the communist government in East Germany. So they erect a wall that separates East Berlin from West Berlin. Um, Khrushchev will deliver an ultimatum to Berlin that all Berlin will be given to East Germany. The United States says, well, if you try that, it's probably going to be end in war. Again, this is this brinkmanship again, not backing down. In response, East Germany built a wall, and overnight the flow of refugees stopped because there was a barrier there. Berlin will receive Kennedy. He will deliver a speech to the East West Berliners, and he will say, "Ich bin ihr Berliner. I am a Berliner." Apparently, the translation is, "I am a jelly donut." Of course, people in Berlin knew what he was talking about, but sort of smirked and laughed a bit. This shows the Berlin Wall, which since has been removed in the 1990s. This was Checkpoint Charlie, where you could go from East Berlin to West Berlin, closely regulated and guarded. Many people tried to get out of East Berlin, flee to the west. Some were successful, some were taken captive, some were killed. Ich in Berliner, I am a jelly donut. Of course, again, he was trying to identify with the West Berliners that he was with them. As a result, tensions ease and when the wall is constructed. Um, the Cuban Missile Crisis will happen in 1962. Uh, in response to the United States placing missiles in Turkey, Khrushchev decides that he will put missiles in Cuba and say that Cuba is under the Soviet umbrella. We discovered that there's missiles in there, and we will demand that they are removed. And so tensions heighten. Kennedy puts a naval quarantine around Cuba and says no more ships will be able to come in there delivering missiles, and he demands that the missiles be removed. Uh, it looked as though during this time that the United States and the Soviet Union would go to war, but was narrowly averted. In fact, it was 100 yards within hundreds of yards of ships making contact with one another. The United States was not going to allow a convoy of Soviet freighters to go to Cuba, um, and it almost became a shooting war. Kennedy's advisors advised him to invade Cuba and take out the missiles, something called a surgical airstrike, but that doesn't. It meant that some of the missiles would be launched against the United States. And Kennedy looks for a different solution than a preemptive airstrike. This shows the launch pads in Cuba. Again, this picture of Cuba or Khrushchev going eye to eye with Kennedy, and apparently Kennedy's got his finger on the button and willing to blow up the Soviet Union with an H-bomb. This shows the Cuban Missile Crisis and this quarantine. The missiles could reach as far as New York and some of the major cities in the United States, but this is averted. One of the things that will help the situation, there is no direct communication with Moscow, so through back channels, his brother, Robert Kennedy, will make contact with diplomats from the Russians, and they will agree that the Americans take out the missiles in Turkey, and then they'll take the missiles out of Cuba. For a week, the world watched as the Soviet ships moved on Cuba. A Brinkmann ship was, again, as I said, employed. Eventually, the 16 Soviet ships stopped and turned around. Apparently, Khrushchev didn't see necessarily the national interest of the Soviet Union being served by leaving those missiles in Cuba. But we'll remove the missiles in Turkey, and Kennedy looks like a hero to the world. He's tough on communists. After this Cuban Missile Crisis, there seems to be a new spirit of cooperation between the U.S. and the Soviets. Both sides know that World War III was a whisker from happening. So in the future, both men tried to prevent war. The Nuclear Test Ban Treaty in 1963 was signed, and it said that there would be no more testing of bombs in the atmosphere. Hotline is installed between Moscow and Washington, D.C. Unfortunately, Kennedy is going to be assassinated in 1963 by his alleged shooter, Lee Harvey Oswald. Later, he's going to be killed by Jack Ruby in retaliation for killing the president. This shows the president exiting the plane in Dallas. This is the motorcade just prior to his assassination. This is the grassy knoll, which some report that shots came from. And Kennedy is going to die within an hour. He was rushed to a hospital, but part of his brain has been blown out, and he's not going to survive. There's still mystery swirling around this assassination. No one knows for sure if there were multiple shooters or just one. This is the spot where the Kennedy was killed, or at least shot. This is a picture of Lee Harvey Oswald. No one knows for sure whether he actually shot Kennedy or not, but an investigation was made, and the blame was placed on him. Lyndon Johnson will become president. He will appoint the Warren Commission to investigate the assassination, and their conclusion is that it was not a conspiracy. It was a lone gunman and firing from the Book Conservatory in Dallas. President Johnson is going to be sworn in. The Warren Commission clears up some of the confusion about the assassination. Johnson administration pledged to continue Kennedy's policies. He will get the Civil Rights Act through and tax cuts. He will begin what he calls his war on poverty, to eliminate poverty in the United States. Sounds a bit like Hoover in the election of 1928, but then we faced the Great Depression. 1964, he cut about $10 billion in taxes, and it triggered an economic boom. He's going to be re-elected or elected in '64 after he serves out the remaining term of Kennedy. He starts a platform called the Great Society, similar to the New Deal type measures that is going to help the disadvantaged in America. There is someone that you'll need to know, Michael Harrington's The Other America, pointed out the poverty in America. He will run against Barry Goldwater, a Republican from Arizona, a staunch conservative, who attacked the federal income tax, Social Security system, civil rights legislation, nuclear test ban treaty, and the Great Society programs that Johnson was instituting. Many considered him the father of the modern conservative movement. He suggested that military commanders should be able to use tactical nuclear weapons in the field. There was a famous commercial where a little girl was picking daisies and a nuclear bomb explodes in the back. And he's seen as an extremist, someone who's going to plunge us into World War III, and Johnson is going to be elected. Johnson wins a landslide in the election of 1964. Barry Goldwater carries a few southern states and his own state of Arizona. So it's a landslide. The Democrats control both the House and the Senate. Democrats felt that a mandate from the people for the new social programs. The Great Society, the War on Poverty, the Office of Economic Opportunity is formed to provide money to depressed areas for redevelopment. Medicare 1965 is passed that gives medical insurance to elderly people. Head Start was put together to help children of disadvantaged families in ghettos and poverty areas so that they would get ready for elementary school. This is preschool. This Great Society actually was a speech that he delivered at the University of Michigan in 1964. This shows a picture of Head Start. Still a program in the United States. The Department of Housing and Urban Development is created to make it more affordable for the poor. More consumer protection and environmental laws are passed. One of the things that I think you can point to on Johnson is his tremendous success in the civil rights movement. The 24th Amendment is going to be passed during his watch. Although he hasn't anything to do with that, he does support it. The Civil Rights Act 1964, banning discrimination in public places and employment. The EEOC is created to make sure that people are not being discriminated on the job site. And we'll stop right there.